Welcome, everyone, to the seventh episode of the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, the podcast on all things forecasting and geopolitics. This week, myself and Andrew are joined by two major people in the forecasting space, Pavel Atanasov and Regina Joseph of Pitho.io. Regina has been with Global Guessing in the past. She joined us for an interview back in January, but we are especially excited to have both of them on today to talk about the results from one of their recent projects, Human Forest. For a little bit of background, Regina and Pavel are part of Pitho. Pitho is a two-person boutique R&D shop for forecasting where they use decision science to improve predictions and decision makings. They've spent a decade working on this research and have won 3 IARPA forecasting tournaments and 2 NSF awards. They are co-inventors on a patent and a patent pending project and are the co-authors on numerous publications. Today, they are here to talk to us about their most recent project, which is the subject of their pending patent, Human Forest. Human Forest is a new system that they've been developing, which combines data-driven base rate automation and collective human insight to deliver on key objectives on which machine algorithms and human forecasters can fall short. Human Forest is designed to provide more accurate valuations, forward-looking risk management, better resource allocations, and multipliers to progress in innovation. Welcome to the show, Regina and Pavel. It would be great if you guys could give us a little bit more insight into the background and the concept of Human Forest, as well as Pitho itself. Welcome.
Great. Thanks so much. It's great to be back. It's nice to see you both, and thanks so much for having us both on so that we can talk to you about what we've been working on for the last couple of years. And so Human Forest actually. It's a really good example of how Pavel and I work at a 50-50 level, because it really combines very much equally ideas that I have with ideas that Pavel has, and that's how we kind of make our work. So the origins of Human Forest began when Pavel and I were members of the IARPA HFC, or Hybrid Forecasting Competition Research Program, was underway. And so we served on a team that was based at University of Southern California's Information Sciences Institute. And so because the nature of that research program was focused on hybridizing the best components of human predictive accuracy with machine model predictions, and to figure out what is the optimal way to hybridize those two things into a whole that would be more predictively accurate than each individual factor. And so one of the things that I had been thinking about and developing for that program was the idea of the elicitation platform, or forecasting platform, if you will. There are many different ways you can build those things. And as I think Pavel and I have shown over the last 10 years, you can organize these so that they do different things. And so what I was interested in a hybridized forecasting environment was being able to reduce the cognitive burden on the individual forecaster, right? Forecasting is not an easy thing. It requires a lot of effort. And so I think the goal in building an optimal forecasting platform has a lot to do with reducing the cognitive burden to enough of a degree that the user is getting useful information. And so one of the key, most important bits of useful information in a predictive sense is the base rate. Especially if you're in a timed tournament where questions may have a very short period of time to elapse, being able to get to that initial forecast as quickly as possible is the coin of the realm. And so what I was interested in was in developing a user interface, user experience, or UI UX, in which that element is actually baked into the user experience. So that became a big part of what we were doing on the HFC team, that we were on the SAGE team, and so that obviously became part of the basis of what became Human Forest. And so I'll let Pavel take over where we started to kind of layer the ideas that we were having about how to elicit better forecasts.
Right. Yeah. So at HFC, so what Regina was the idea that Regina developed was that it may be useful to just show people just some historical information without showing them a model, right? Because people wouldn't be able to access it otherwise, or it will take them more time. So by shortening that process, you can add a lot of value. And that related to what Kahneman and Tversky have spoken for a long time about the idea that there's the inside view and the outside view, and the outside view is basically, thinking about base rates, right? But thinking through base rate is non-trivial because you have to first come up with a reference class, and there's many reference classes that you can come up with. Like if you think of an election, is the right reference class, let's say the last 10 presidential elections in the US? Is it all the elections in the world? There's many reasonable reference classes you can come up with. And so what we became interested in is like, how good are people at picking up reference classes that give them good base rates? We know to some extent algorithms sort of do that, right? The random forest algorithm basically looks at different random subsets of the data and tries to come up with basically a reference class. They call it a classification tree. And then any one tree maybe has only partial information and it's noisy and not very accurate. But when you combine all these trees into a forest, you get a good prediction. And so, our thought was like, well, can humans do that? Like, what if a bunch of humans build their classification tree or reference classes, and then we combine that into a forest, and that would be the human forest. And we had just met with a friend of mine from college who had developed a random forest model for a clinical trial development. And I had been working on a project like that with Jonathan Kimmelman, getting experts to predict trials on oncology and neurology. And so we thought, well, what if we combine all the ideas together, all the work that they had done on the modeling, all the work that we are doing on hybridizing forecasting, and explore like, how do we get better at forecasting clinical trials, and how do we teach people to get better at picking up reference classes that are predictively useful. And so there's the applied part, and there's just the basic psychology of forecasting and how people relate to the outside view. And that was very attractive to us, and it was attractive to the National Science Foundation as well. And we were able to get 2 grants to study this.
And I think what was also really interesting to both of us was, at the time, I think that when HFC began, it was really at the beginning of the trajectory upwards in this kind of monolithic idea that machine learning and machine models will always be better, especially in terms of predictive analytics. People were observing the IBM Watson story. So, Watson itself was claiming that Watson was a predictive system. And so, but, in our experience, directly the research that we were experiencing, we were seeing in action just how well, poorly these models were performing in arenas that were situations where there was a low data environment. In other words, just didn't have very many use cases upon which you could train the model effectively. So in those kinds of environments, humans were really doing much better. They were outperforming the machine models, and in many cases by a lot. And these were models that were developed by people who are, considered some of the best modelers out there. So we were coming into the conversation with Ståle at the time that, he was saying, yes, we've developed this random forest model at Johns Hopkins, which was the university that he was with at the time. Now he's at AU, American University. And so we were having lunch in DC, and we were saying, oh, it would be great for us to work on something together. And so that competitive edge sort of came into the conversation, where we thought, well, we've seen in HFC, humans with machines and how that was working. What would have been really interesting was humans versus machines, that, and to really kind of do two things. One, which is kind of challenge that status quo thinking about how machine learning, is the answer in prediction. When we were observing in real time, this is not the case in very specific arenas. And also too, to be able to test in real time this kind of head-to-head competition, make it fun, make it interesting. And it was a kind of perfect opportunity for us.
So if I have the sort of the structure correct of sort of human forest, it deals with sort of how can we combine sort of base rate information and sort of these technological sort of systems, as well as cognitive training for individuals to elicit better forecasts. So you guys created your own sort of forecasting platform where I imagine you would present a question and then they would have easily accessible base rates available to them, which they could use, they could manipulate perhaps, and sort of start off with a base rate, but then sort of reach their own conclusion by inputting other information. And then you sort of did that in a tournament against these machine models. Is that a sort of a fair?
That's part of it. The way to think of it conceptually is, that the elicitation platform itself is just one component. So we talk a lot about, what we see at Pitho as this, what we call a 5-step supply chain of predictive accuracy. The elicitation platform is just the 4th step, right? There are other steps you have to get all 5 of these steps working well with each other to get the optimal predictive performance that you can squeeze out of it, right? So the elicitation platform is one part of it. I think the best way to think about what we're trying to achieve with Human Forest, and this actually came a lot from the cybersecurity research work that I was doing in the Netherlands. This is separate from Pitho, but one of the things that I was seeing was people have databases that they have to work with, especially in the, when you're doing cybersecurity. The first tiers of analysts are basically using automated systems that sit on top of these very large, very complex databases. That information is constantly being added to. And people who are trained in this still find it very difficult to extract predictively useful information out of these large databases. Now, cybersecurity is one arena, but this also applies to arenas like the life sciences world. Clinical trials, the database that we work with, Biomed Tracker, Informa, which is the company that owns, these massive commercial databases. I mean, Andrew, I'm sure you're familiar with LexisNexis. I mean, you work in these kinds of environments where, whether it's legal or life sciences or cyber or energy, usually if you're operating that system as an analyst and you have to make predictions or forecasts, you have to work with these large commercial databases that are quite expensive. The problem is that, and what we've been hearing, and this was what I was hearing in the cyber research, was that the bigger and more data that these databases have, the more difficult it is to work with them. So part of what we were trying to envision Human Forest as, and using a clinical trial database as a sort of experimental example to test our hypothesis, is that there has to be a way to get into these data sets and extract the predictively useful information more effectively. We see, so that's how we sort of came to describe Human Forest as an information scaffold. If you think of, big databases like LexisNexis, for example, as a skyscraper, think of Human Forest as the scaffold that can wrap around that skyscraper and allow you more effective egress and ingress to the exact locations you need. And that's how we, there's certainly, yes, the elicitation platform has a lot of bells and whistles to it, But the overall system and method, the approach that we have is about incorporating everything from, the right types of questions, because that determines, what happens on the elicitation platform, what types of crowds you want to put together, who are on those expert panels and who should be on those expert panels. Because we do know more and more with every passing year something about the differences between subject matter experts versus skilled forecasters versus lay people, especially in technically dense information environments. So that's very interesting to us. So you've got step one from our perspective is the people who are the people in your human crowds. The second being the questions. What kinds of rigorous questions are you developing and using, because that that has a direct role on or a direct impact on how useful the forecasts are. The third, of course, is the training. And then the fourth is the elicitation platform. How are you extracting that information out of the forecasters? And the fifth, of course, being the aggregation. How do you put all of those individual human estimations together in a way that really optimizes the utility of those estimations? And so, so the bigger picture is that scaffold concept. There are lots of databases out there. They're not easy to use. And given that more and more of us have to work through conditions of uncertainty, having a method by which you can use those databases, but have some layer and overlay that sits on top of them that allows you to make better judgments and decisions, because you are extracting those base rates. You're also getting visualizations, the kind of bird's eye view of what the data means, and also giving you the facility by which you can actually adjust away from the base rate if you think, the base rate captures what's inside that database. But, as a human being, I'm getting much more recent information that might actually be additive to what's stored or what's locked in that database. And that's what makes, human crowdsourcing effective. It's that ability to update very quickly, new information as it comes in. That's harder to do with a machine model.
And just to make it very specific about, to make it very concrete what we're asking. So we might ask, will drug A successfully proceed from phase 2 to phase 3? And then what the user can do is to say, all right, well, what are all the cancer drugs in phase 2, right? And maybe there's 1,000 examples. But how about for this particular type of cancer, right? And there's maybe only 200. But how about, if it's a biologic drug and it's a lead indication, right? And then you refine the reference class so it gets more and more specific to the case at hand, but it also becomes smaller. So then the forecasters have to make a trade-off between something that's more specific and something that's larger. And eventually, when they get to that reference class, it might say, okay, well, we got 50 trials and 20 of them were successfully proceeded from phase 2 to phase 3. So your base rate is 40%. And then you can take the slider and say, okay, well, I think 40% is too little because I just found some new information that's not in the database. And I really think it's like 52%. And that's what you submit. And then when a bunch of forecasters get through that process, that's what forms the human forest.
And so just real quick, 2 questions on that front. The first one is sort of like a larger question, which is how do you go about gathering all that sort of data for base rates? Are you sort of scraping through academic papers and press releases trying to find like a keyword like this is a monoclonal antibody, this is a something else, this is related to this type of cancer, and then you're doing it that way? Because I would guess the other way, if it's thousands of drugs, you're not going to be opening up and reading each paper. That would take forever, right?
No, that's where Biomed Tracker is really useful, because they put that information in a very organized way. There's that which is proprietary in clinicaltrials.gov. You have to submit information to clinicaltrials.gov when you run a trial, and so in that way it's very useful. There is information out there, and the question is, how do you get from 1,000 possible predictor variables to like maybe 20 or 30 that humans can handle, right? And for that, it helps to have done some statistical analysis and modeling at the first place, and then hand it off to human forecasters to see if they can do better than the model you just built.
And in the case of human force specifically, we also have to deal with the level playing field issue. A lot of the parameters that we have to use in setting up the taxonomy for the elicitation platform, we have to take our cues from the random forest model, because the random forest model was already in existence, at the time that we were having the conversation with them. So they had already been using Biomed Tracker. So to some degree, it came down to, well, we're starting already with the machine model, and then it was up to us, so Swala and his colleagues were completely on team machine model, and it was just me and Pavel on the team human side. And so, but what we were looking at was, given the fact that the random forest model had already been built, so we already knew what were some of the key components that we would have to extract out of the Biomed Tracker data set. So it wasn't a complete, we're just pulling out of, the thousands of categories that already exist. We already had some guidelines. What we tried to do was to try to structure that in a way that, and we'll see this, I think, a lot more in the second leg of our research, but looking at ways in which our work now is starting to have some influence on how the random forest model is being built. So they're going to go through an optimization process now. And so what we're looking at is, how we've already seen now the results of the first leg. So, the key is we've got a sort of baseline benchmark, for how the ontology that we already set up for the specific Biomed Tracker database works. We see how that works for the random forest model. And so now what we're trying to focus on is, okay, well, how do we optimize that? Especially just given we were very lucky because we're dealing with in real life pandemic situations, so, and that had a very clear and direct effect on, our results.
So, Regina, you just touched on, forecasting in a pandemic environment. And Pavel, you mentioned, forecasting these oncology therapy results.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the challenges, of forecasting each of those sort of discrete areas of science? And then, were there any similarities in some of the challenges that you saw between the two?
And then if I just may throw in, like, how is it sort of shifting from focusing on sort of the cancer oncology aspect to the sort of pandemic vaccine nature?
Yeah, so the short way of describing it is cancer trials are usually slow trials and COVID trials are much faster, right? So in a cancer trial, you want to know if it's going to be successful, and you don't so much care if it reports results in a month or in 6 months. But in a global pandemic, you not only want to know if this vaccine would work, but also when it would work, when you get the results, and when you would learn if it works so that you can apply it, right? People describe it as a race against time, like a race between the different variants of the virus and the vaccines, and as well as treatments. And so for that, it was very important to have what we call time-specific questions, which is like, will this trial proceed, let's say, from phase 2 to phase 3 or phase 3 to regulatory submission by a given date? And when we started the experiment, we started in September. So there was a political question also if there will be announcements before the election, and in general there were many questions like, before the next wave comes, do we have vaccines? And so that's where having those time-specific questions is very useful. It's also very useful because at the end you have a definitive answer, right? The effect either happened or didn't happen. With questions that are open-ended about time, well, the tournament is over and the trial hasn't proceeded from phase 2 to phase 3, but it might still proceed, right? And so you don't have a definitive answer. And so we did what we call probabilistic scoring, which is basically to say our best guess is that there's still 30% chance that this trial will proceed, and we'll score forecasters, against that probabilistic benchmark. With time specific, at the end of the tournament, we knew what were the yeses and what were the nos. So it was different in approach, and as well as the underlying sort of clinical importance of each set of trials.
Were there changes to like the framework though that were done when you had to do these timed forecasts? Did you sort of bring in base rates in terms of not only completion but sort of time to completion? And sort of like to what degree, right? You're talking about politics earlier. Like to what degree was like the Operation Warp Speed timeline used as, for instance, a possible base rate? Because if you were to look at what they had given out, it actually wasn't too far off in terms of at least the overall scope of things.
Mm-hmm.
I think it would be fair to say that, with regards to the actual timing that was happening around the development of the vaccines and the treatments for COVID, that was less of our concern. And also, if you just look at the general timing of what was going on, in the first leg of the research, at that point, things were, still kind of in the first phase of lockdown, right? So when we were building out the elicitation platform and the experimental design and how we were going to put all of that together, the things that we were focused on at that point in time, we weren't even focused on what was happening, whether or not those vaccines or treatments would actually occur. In general, what we first needed to deal with was, because our initial focus was on the slower moving trials for oncology, neurology, and cardiovascular diseases, we were kind of in the middle of a scramble of, well, given the nature of the pandemic, all of those trials are going to get pushed to the back burner. Those trials are going to slow down completely. So the research that we would be doing in that area, well, if you've got a 6-month tournament, during that 6-month period of elapse, if it's happening in the middle of a pandemic, it's so unlikely, that we would see any kind of a resolution of questions that are in the non-COVID related clinical trial sphere, that the questions effectively become like 90-10 questions, and so they are kind of rendered useless. So at that point, I mean, in the beginning, when we started doing the experimental design, for me, it was as the question generator, it was particularly important to understand how we were going to make the forecasters comfortable with the idea of a probabilistic resolution versus a deterministic resolution, especially for elite forecasters. There's so much wiggle room, in what goes into a probabilistic resolution, that we knew, and especially, given the fact that, we had a bunch of fellow super forecasters, making forecasts here, we know them well enough that they would poke holes through that very, very quickly and very easily. So part of what I was thinking was, already, even before the pandemic lockdowns began, was thinking about how are we going to work more deterministic types of questions in here, right? We can't just be thinking about the probabilistic resolutions, because that exposes the research. And then when the pandemic slammed, then it was, okay, now we have to think pragmatically, about how do we continue to work in the doing this research when, a big chunk of the clinical trials that we're looking at probably are not going to proceed. What's filling into that vacuum is everything COVID related, which gives us a perfect inflection point for time specific questions, because there would be a much higher likelihood that you would get a status quo change during the period of elapse in the forecasting tournament. And so that really became the stepping stone towards developing a survival analysis, the two variants of the platform are specific. One is probabilistic, one is time specific. So the time specific variant allowed us to do a different type of analysis than what was being done in the non-time specific variant, and even better, that could still allow us to maintain a level playing field with the machine learning model, because there was actually a random survival forest model that could be integrated into the existing model that we were competing against. So it worked out really well.
Great. So now we've talked sort of about what Human Forest was. You guys recently presented a poster about your initial results, and I was wondering if you could provide us with sort of a brief overview of the top level results that you guys were able to achieve with this time-specific Human Forest system.
Yeah. So again, those analyses focused on 28 questions that were specific to COVID and that had time-specific deterministic resolution. So at the end, we knew which trials progressed and which ones did not. And the high-level comparison is the random survival model versus the different human methods. And what was very important is that all the all the human methods, including the control, but especially the human forest methods, outperform the machine model by approximately 40%. So 40% reduction in Breyer scores. Within the human methods, there were somewhat smaller differences where the human forest method tended to do well. So the outperformance relative to the random forest model was up to 48%, and for the regular control polls where people didn't get to work on the human forest platform, it was by about 32%, and those differences were more accentuated for questions where we allowed fewer forecasters to make predictions. So when we have only a couple of forecasters, it's very, very helpful to use human forest. And when you have more forecasters, the differences are somewhat smaller, but still important. More than 10 percentage points in a reduction in Breyer score.
So you talked about this reduction in Breyer score. Could you quickly give just a brief explanation of what Breyer scores were, and if you guys were using the classical Breyer score out of 1, or if you're using the good judgment Breyer score out of 2?
Yeah, we were using the good judgment Breyer score out of 2. So 0 is best possible forecast. 2 is the worst possible forecast. 0.5 is the score you get if you make a 50-50 forecast on a binary question, whichever outcome occurs. And it's basically a squared error measure of the difference between reality, for deterministic questions 0 or 1, and your probabilistic forecast. So you want to be as close to 0 as possible. And so if let's say if one of the models is, let's say, at 0.25, a 40% reduction means that you go from 0.25 Breyer score to 0.15, which is approximately where the random survival forest model ended up, 0.25, and the best human forest methods ended up just below 0.15. So that was just over 40% reduction in Breyer scores.
Great. And so now we actually want to dig into sort of some of these findings and get just a little bit deeper in terms of what you guys found. Starting off on the top, if you guys are watching the podcast on YouTube,
Sure.
you guys can actually see some of the results. And so this dotted line up here, this is what the random survival forest model got. You said it was 0.25. If I'm not mistaken, that is roughly the equivalent of forecasting a 65% confidence on a question and getting it correct.
Yeah.
That, to me, seems actually surprisingly low for a machine model for this, especially for a field that has such well-defined base rates, right? If we were talking about geopolitics, where trying to find that reference class is in many ways like in art, it would seem like forecasting phase 2 and phase 3 trials would be more on the science side of things, but the random survival forest models did quite poorly. Do you guys have a sort of hypothesis as to why that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, this is not an uncommon experience. I mean, we had seen this before in our research, where the models just simply the availability of the data only allows the model to be, good to, there's kind of a cap, really. And so what we were seeing was that, I think that most people probably they assumed that the accuracy or the validity of a model, most people don't know what the rates of accuracy are in the first place. I mean, I've worked with Watson, and I know the thresholds that were considered acceptable for accuracy for the use of Watson, which, I mean, I would not consider acceptable, as a human forecaster. No way, no how. So I think that generally speaking, with a machine model returning an accuracy of about 65%, that's generally accepted as pretty good performance. And so for us to be able to see that as, okay, I have to say that for me, when I looked at that Breyer score, I thought, yeah, that's about in line with what I was expecting. And obviously previously what we knew about that particular model in terms of its prior performance.
And then sort of returning back to this sort of chart here real quick, what I found to be particularly interesting is looking at all forecasts. The best result was actually just those that had base training rather than full training. Do you guys have sort of a hypothesis? Right, you would think that getting the full training would, produce the lowest sort of Breyer scores. Do you think that there was something in the full training that was originally suited for the oncology that didn't make the best transition for time? Was it chance, or because we're dealing with low Breyer scores? Is this, just
Yeah, no, we have
expected to happen?
we have two we have two hypotheses. In short, both of them really deal with the issue of cognitive burden. There is a point at which, so starting with the technical side of the cognitive burden issue, again, to maintain a level playing field between the machine model and our human system, we had to make sure that the questions that were being applied were the same, could be triggered by the same, could be resolved by the same triggers. So in that respect, the base rate data that is in the public domain, there are lots of papers that mention this information. The base rate data was already incorporated into the random forest model. So we had to ensure that our control, as well as our experimental conditions, all had access to the same basic information upon which the random forest model was operating. So just that core base rate data that's in the public domain, that's what was given to the control poles as part of the base training. That's very short to have to go through. It's basically a table, with a series of numbers and a bunch of columns depending upon what particular indication and what phase transition. So you could look at that in the space of about 3 or 5 minutes and get a pretty decent handle on, what the base rates are. Training, however, is, a 22 minutes, a 22-minute experience that builds on the base rate data by giving you additional information on how to be a better forecaster, and then contextualizing the base rate data with the how to forecast information. And so what we think, in addition to the nature of the base rate data was already just a kind of immediate benchmark for everybody to work with, was that in the middle of a pandemic, people are already super stressed. I mean, that was a real issue for us in the experimental environment. People are tired, people have fatigue. And so asking people to go, the difference between spending 5 minutes on a training module versus spending 20 minutes on a training module, in the real world, if there was no pandemic, I think that we would probably see better numbers. But in a pandemic environment where every minute counts, the difference of, 20 minutes can make a big difference. And especially when you're talking about, for example, say female forecasters who have to work a double shift, right? So there were real world possible reasons as to why we were seeing that. And, and also, of course, the technical aspect of it, which is that, just very simply, um, base rates, the base rate that you're working with at the control level, at the random forest level, it's enough to get you where you need to go. If you've got a lot of people, and you're taking the average of that, then it's pretty good, right? It's pretty good. Is it as good as it can be? No, but I think we were working with some real world situation issues that made that a little bit more complicated. And also too, we just had to conform to certain strictures. If we were in an environment where we had a control where they did not get the base rate data, I'm pretty sure, that there would be a much bigger disparity between the control, and everybody else. And I think it's important to remember that, uh, if you think about the number of people in the full training, was half of that, in the base training. So I think that there were definite reasons why we saw not as quite, not as expected a difference between full training versus base training as we saw. I think if we were under different experimental conditions, if we were not in a pandemic, if we did not have to supply the control with any kind of training material, I think we'd see something quite different.
So relative to the random survival forest baseline that Clay had brought up recently, thank you. You saw a much steeper reduction in Breyer scores with additional forecasters and with both human forest models rather, like both the approaches. Do you have any thoughts as to why that was the case, and is it sort of an indication that that machine human like hybridization is sort of fulfilling a lot of the functions of pulling out the wisdom from the crowd, which is part of the goal?
Right. So we should note that the random forest model doesn't take any data from forecasters. So it's if you had the figure, it would just be like a flat line at right around 0.25. The other methods like control polls, where people didn't have the human forest platform versus human forest, that's crowdsourcing, right? That depends on crowd members. And the smallest crowd you can have is a crowd of one, so that's not really a crowd, that's just one person. And it turns out that when you give that one person information about base rates and allow them to play with the data, they do much better on average than if you don't. And then as you average more and more forecasters, the difference become a little bit smaller, but still remain intact. So it may be like 20-22% difference for just one person, and 10-12% when you have five or more. And that's what the hybridization is meant to do, right? By showing people data, they become more stable. But still, having more than one person, having even a small crowd, is still helpful in reducing noise and improving accuracy.
And just to go back to this sort of like result, I was wondering why you felt that sort of the human forest with just one forecaster on the question was getting the same results as the control polls. Because that, right, because then after once you start adding forecasters, you start seeing a difference between the two. But for the audio listeners, when there's just one forecaster on the question, the control forecasters do as well as the baseline, just adjusted human forest model.
Yeah, we think that that's because some forecasters were very confident in sort of ignoring the base rates and going with what they thought was best. And when you have just a couple of forecasters doing really poorly, that brings up your score, right? Because it's squared error. So like a couple of extreme errors pull up the average. And so what the blue line is doing is you're taking an average between each person's base rate and their adjusted forecast, where they moved the slider away from the base rate and to where they thought it should be. And when you take that average, you get rid of the biggest, sort of most egregious errors. And it really helps, even with one person, to improve accuracy on average. why, so some of the forecasters basically just ignore the base rate and they did poorly. And when you channel back those base rates into the aggregate, it helps quite a bit. So we learned something about how to aggregate information from the human forest environment.
And then just to sort of continue on that, and I think we just briefly talked about this when talking about all the stresses of the pandemic and how that would affect forecasters, but I did some mental math. The gap here between control poles and the base rate and adjusted human forest model over here is about 0.035 of a Brier score difference, which on the good judgment scale, I think, is about 2.5% extra confidence in the correct direction. So if you originally were to give 70% on a forecast that were to come true, then that sort of Brier score reduction would indicate roughly a 72.5% confidence, or if it was going to be incorrect, it'd be the other direction, which is certainly notable, right? Every single additional point is very useful to getting better accuracy in forecasts, but that also seems like a pretty small reduction to have. And one would even think, if you have all these sort of stresses of a pandemic in time, that an elicitation platform like Human Forest, which tries to ease the cognitive load, would actually sort of excel better. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts in terms of sort of why you saw that result, and then also how the improvements that you saw in Human Forest compared to what you did with the SAGE geopolitical forecasting in the past.
Well, I think, you know, a good way to start the response is really to, if you're looking at the results in just a pure absolutist, from an absolutist perspective, you know, even that alone, it's not a trivial number here. But I think it helps to start by pulling back a little bit, so that you're looking at a sort of bigger picture framework. Because when you think about environments in which this type of estimation is critical, like for example, in the life sciences realm, where people are using this information to forecast a drug's price, or, you know, whether or not this drug will actually succeed, right? So that may not seem a lot, but when you start to draw back and you're talking about an environment where, you know, tens, hundreds of millions of dollars are at stake here, that is a non-trivial amount of improvement. And so in IRL, you know, it matters quite a lot. And so, but even in the context of, you know, experimentally speaking, it's still non-trivial. You know, this is still a good result. I think a lot of it has to comes down to, you know, from which angle are you looking at that information?
Yeah, and so the way that IARPA usually sets it up when they run tournaments like that is that you look in terms of percentage improvement from, you know, the control method to the you know, new method.
The government sets a benchmark, basically.
And so let's say the differences were a little bit bigger, but let's just round them down and say, you know, if the control was at 0.18 and then you go to 0.15, so that's about 17 percentage points, right? So the actual differences were closer to, you know, 18 or 19 percentage points reduction in Brier scores, right? And so that's how IARPA used to score us, and we've sort of learned that rule, because that's how they determine if they want to give us more funding or not, right? And so when you put that into perspective, right, like maybe it's up to 20% at the high end, down to 10% on the low end, if when you have more forecasters, that's similar to the difference we found. So I was a lead author on a paper in management science comparing prediction polls and prediction markets, and we found, oh, prediction polls are about, you know, 12% better. That was significant, and so that was the point of the paper. And so when you have 12-15% improvement in accuracy, that's already, you know, enough to be an important you know, scientific result and also enough to be practical, right? So we're somewhere in that area where you're getting to something that's robust, but it's also just practically relevant. One way to think about it is like, think about like a bunch of coin tosses, right? And you can only bet on heads, right? In one case, you get heads 48% of the time, the coin is weighted against you. In the other case, you get 52% of the time, right? It's only, 4 percentage points better. But in one hand, if you keep playing the game many, many times, you'll go bankrupt. In the other one, you'll make a bunch of money, right? So sometimes a small improvement in accuracy could make the difference between, making more money and just going bankrupt.
Bankruptcy and billionairedom.
Right. So now you may not be a 48-52, but like that's one example where what seems like a small change in accuracy could actually make the difference. It gives you a little bit more of an edge, and if that holds over time, it could be very practically relevant.
Well, great. That is very interesting with the Human Forest. What is sort of the next steps in the Human Forest project? You guys had said that you had finished sort of the first phase. What is phase 2 going to look like?
Yeah, so we are going to have phase 2, which is a second tournament. One thing we would say is we are very much looking for participants. So if you'd like, if you're interested in this kind of work, it will be about clinical trials again, but there'll be some cool new features. So you can go to peto.io/humanforest. Once again, peto.io/humanforest, one word. You can sign up for that. One thing we would do is we'll have a shorter intake, so you get, you have to spend less time between signing up for the tournament and making your first forecast, which we knew was a bottleneck in the first implementation. And so we're going to take it away, make it easier, streamline it so that people can get quicker from signing up to, doing forecasts, which is what a lot of folks love to do. So we would love to have bigger groups, test more interesting hypotheses about what works and doesn't work, and improve the science basically.
And will it be the sort of the Human Forest timed and focusing on pandemic stuff, or given where we are right now, is it shifting back to the drug treatment and the oncology side of things?
It's a good question. It'll probably, it'll be a mix of both. It's and now I think a lot depends on timing, but again, we seem to have found ourselves in this very unusual sweet spot of asking highly pertinent forecasting questions at a time when real change is happening in real time in the middle of a forecasting tournament. So that's pretty exciting. And especially in life sciences, just given how glacially slow the pace normally is, we couldn't have asked for better timing here. So we think that the second leg will also come at a very interesting time, as, are the trials that got postponed or essentially frozen due to the pandemic last year, how quickly do those get online? Does the speed of the COVID related trials, because the speed on those trials was unprecedented, plus also some of the decisions taken, these approvals were all done through emergency use authorizations. Mm-hmm. That is a highly rare contingency. There isn't a lot of base rate information on the use of EUAs. And the random forest model was not designed to be triggered to EUAs. So therefore, there were rules that we created around our questions, so that forecast resolutions could not be triggered with EUAs. So now we enter into a new phase, where we're seeing the potential where we might have a status quo change in both the deterministic questions, which is, the time-specific COVID-related, infectious disease-related questions, as well as the slower moving probabilistic questions, for example, in the oncology space, that as those start to come back online, and we've certainly seen a lot of activity around drugs in the neurology space, for example, Eli Lilly, a lot of focus on their Alzheimer's drug, so all of that is happening now. So we could see, clinical trial transitions happening in real time while we're in the middle of a tournament. So that's another bit of lucky timing on our part.
And do you think that there's any sort of potential that, like, since the pandemic, that sort of future trials that normally were slow might come out at a sort of a more rapid pace, and that, there was like a poll recently where like people are now all for like human trials for, obviously that was a small subset for vaccines, but, moving forward, might that change sort of the landscape of drugs and that whole process?
Yeah, I mean, the FDA announced, I think it was like 2 months ago now, they announced that now they are going to make it easier to approve drugs with the use of EUA and EUA-like policies. They're going to shorten the time. It's not impossible now to run clinical trials without a placebo. So within the regulatory structure, there are already moves being taken to kind of change the clinical trial landscape that people were used to pre-pandemic. So that's certainly a factor. And, I think the lesson learned by a lot of pharmaceutical, and especially some of the smaller startup biotechs that are, proliferating in the space, that there's a real opportunity if you are, first of all, if you're well capitalized enough, and you have the right class of drug that you want to test in an environment where you can, set up a trial fairly quickly, then yeah, I think that I think everybody has seen that what COVID did has changed the stakes on several levels of the clinical trial process.
Yeah, and that's an opportunity for us because every time there's a regime change, right? Every time something happens that's external to how things have been before, that's some kind of shock, then you have to update your models, right? So the old models are just not going to be good enough, and so for humans, it's much easier to update in a new, let's say, regulatory environment than for the models, and so there's an opportunity to outperform. But on the other hand, our friends who are working on the model and colleagues have also learned their lessons, and we expect they're going to give us a harder time this time around. They'll be getting better and better, so we got to keep up.
Yeah, we think that the second tournament is going to be much harder for the human team, much harder. So not because the questions are necessarily harder. We think the questions were pretty hard in the first one, but it's how much are the humans behind the random forest model, how much they learned. So again, it's that human capacity to update quickly. That's going to make the difference, right? So again, we completely stand behind, the opportunity behind Team Human. So.
And just quickly before we wrap, and I think, really important for all of our viewers, do they need any background in forecasting or life sciences to participate in this? Because I think, there's going to be a lot of people interested who may not have that background.
Yeah, no, that's the whole idea behind this experiment. We wanted to, again, kind of push the frontier out a little bit in what we know in the difference between expertise, subject matter expertise, and predictive accuracy, the ability to forecast well, right? So we have seen consistent results that continue to corroborate this evidence that, yeah, just because you're a subject matter expert does not make you particularly skilled at being able to predictively to be accurate in your predictions about events in your domain. But people who are consistently good at forecasting generally tend to be consistently good at forecasting no matter what the subject is. That ultimately is more useful in the context of a prediction environment. So in and of itself, if you're talking about crowds, it is incredibly important for us to be able to continue to see, does that apply as you go into more technically demanding environments. So we were looking at this in a so my research was looking at this in the cybersecurity context. We've seen this in the geopolitical and economic context. With the HFC hybrid forecasting competition was still about geopolitics and economics, but there was still an expectation that, the participants who were mechanical Turkers, right? They weren't even volunteers. There were people who were literally being paid, to go through the effort of making forecasts. So they still had to learn something about the machine models that were being involved. So a big part of what we were trying to do with Human Forest was to see, does that continue to hold up, especially in an environment that is as complicated as clinical trials? And does that hold for people who have zero knowledge or backgrounds or professional experience in the life sciences or forecasting? So that's why for us, it was really important to create cohorts where we had subject matter experts, people who were either in the pharmaceutical industry or working in hospitals or, researchers, people who were forecasters, in particular super forecasters, so skilled forecasters, and people who were consistently good at forecasting. And then people who were just lay people, right? And to begin to see, okay, so who's doing well? And as we've consistently experienced, again, the subject matter expertise is not an indicator of how well you will how accurate your predictions are. It really does come down to that 5-step supply chain. It's where are you getting the base rates from? How well are you applying those base rates in a systematic process of making a forecast? How well are you conducting your open source collection, right? So all of these factors ultimately seem to continually trump the validity of subject matter expertise as the primary driver behind predictive accuracy.
Yeah, but that's the intermediate result, so that might change in the second tournament.
Exactly.
So
After
if you're subject matter experts that run clinical trial, we want you in.
We want you.
Show
Yeah.
them
You're a
show them that
forecaster.
show them that they're wrong. Show them that they're wrong,
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
or they're right. We don't know, right? If you're a
Exactly.
super forecaster, we want you, and if you're neither, we want you still very much to be a forecaster. So anyone and everyone is welcome. If
Yeah.
you're willing
Perfect.
to put in a few hours of work into forecasting, we want you in, and there's some sizable prizes. So come for the forecasting, come for the prizes, come for learning about clinical trials. For any of those reasons, you're very welcome.
And
to
stay
come in.
for the bragging rights to say that you beat the machine, right?
Exactly.
So that's
Team
that's
human.
kind of the that's kind of the idea. But absolutely, I mean, we want everybody, and as we've seen, it is just as likely that somebody with zero life sciences experience will outperform a top clinical researcher. That is entirely possible, and to some degree we kind of expect to see that in the results to a certain degree. So we welcome everybody, every flavor of participants. We need them.
Well, that is great. Everyone, if you guys are interested in participating in phase 2 of the Human Forest Challenge, go to pitho.io /human-forest and sign up. But before we let you guys go, Pavel and Regina, it was so great to have you on. There's always has to be a rapid fire round of questions. The issue, though, is Regina, you've been on the show before, back when it was an interview, so we can't do the same questions. And Pavel, you will be on the podcast, spoiler alert, next week, so we can't ask the questions here for you. That's why we're going to have to do some new rapid fire questions. And this comes from actually our last episode with Sar from Root Claim, because when we got to the rapid fire section, we got into the weeds on the alien question. And so that is what we are forecasting today. The first question for both of you is, what is the likelihood that Earth is currently being observed by alien life?
What is the probability today?
Yes.
observed. Hmm.
Aware of keeping
Probably put it at-
tabs.
Probably put it at about 10%.
Hmm.
And even that, I'm sort of my expectation would probably be lower than that.
I'll go with
Pavel?
1 in 1,000. I'll go with 0.1%.
0.1%.
I
Why
think it's
why so
very-
low?
I think it's very unlikely that there's someone watching us and we can't see them. So
Very
that's-
bearish.
yeah.
And then the second one, I'm guessing this one's
But-
going to be
but-
even
but,
low.
A clarification, are we assuming like, when we say observed, that also means through things like satellite, any type of equipment, that could be, okay, so just double check.
Yeah. Not like just in like a UFO above looking down, like
Right.
Right.
looking from
Yeah,
far
I'd
away.
still put it
This-
in there below. I wouldn't
Okay.
go as Pavel, but.
I'm going to guess this is going to get lower for even both of you, but then what is the likelihood that we have already detected alien life and that on Earth, and that there's evidence of it already?
Well, I'm assuming that also counts for microorganisms that may have hitched a ride on a meteor or something, right?
But we would have to have, yes, that happened and that someone is aware of it.
Oh, okay. Well, in the spirit of, I mean, it's not quite independent estimation. I gave my forecast first. Pavel
Yeah.
came second. I think Pavel should go first now, and I'll come in second. I know what I would forecast that at, but
Yeah. So if it's about any kind of organism, I'll put it maybe at 1%. But if it's about like a sentient organism that's like watching us, then I'll
It'd
put
be the
it
other
at-
way around, that they would have come and now we're watching them in essence.
Yeah, I would put it at let's say 0.5%.
So you think, so it's more likely that we've observed alien life than alien life has observed us.
That's right. Top of the food chain,
yeah, I would
top
agree
of the
with that.
observation chain, I guess.
I would agree. I would agree with that statement. And so in light of that question, I would say, yeah, I would actually flip the forecast. So I would put it at something probably closer to 10% for that question and reduce it to 5% for the prior question.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Great
Well,
updating in action. There you go.
yeah.
Exactly.
Always updating. Always
think-
updating.
I think we'll have to update where we. I don't even know what number we gave last time, but I'm gonna guess it was too high.
Yes.
But
We're
we're
definitely way too bullish.
way too bullish. Well, Pavel, Regina, anything you guys want to say at the end? Where can people find you guys? Where can they find Pitho? All of that great stuff.
Yeah.
Well, our website, come check us out. We're at www.pitho.io. We also have a company page on LinkedIn, and Pavel on Twitter is at Pavel D. Atanasov. And for me on Twitter, I am Super Forecaster, but without the letter E before the last R. So it's kind of Super Forecast R.
Yeah.
And we also have a company. We have both a company. Oh, look, there's Dobry.
Who is that?
Hello.
Hi, this is my cat.
This
Ah.
is a great way to end the interview. This is awesome.
It's a version of the BBC guy in South
Exactly.
Korea. So
That's right.
that was unplanned, but
Yes, but I
this is
assume
Dobry
Marina is not coming into the picture and try to pull Dobry
Right.
out of the
no,
room.
no, not yet.
That's so funny.
Okay.
Red like daddy's got the great. Oh, this was not an accident. This was definitely you. A little bit of
this was
propaganda.
I
was
think
not
this was
staged.
planned.
This
I
was not
think this
staged.
might have been planned.
Yeah, the shirt's too perfect.
Okay, guys.
That's so
It was
funny.
wonderful talking to you. And
Oh, before I forget, so I didn't
Yeah.
mention our Twitter handle was at Pitho, PYTHO_IO. That's our company Twitter handle. We also have one for Human Forest, which is at Human HUMAN Forests with an S at the end.
Perfect. And we'll be sure to link all of those in the description of the video.
Fantastic.
wonderful.
All right,
Fantastic.
wonderful.
All right. Thank you guys so much. That was the Global Guessing Weekly Podcast, episode 7. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks
Thank
so much,
you.
guys. Great seeing you
Yeah.
guys again.
It's great.
Yeah, you as well.